They say land remembers, and that old patch of dry soil behind my house. It remembers everything, especially the sound of my grandfather's boots crunching across it every morning at dawn. The well sat right there at the base of the hill, framed by a half-moon of mesquite trees and a rusted windmill that hadn't spun since Carter was president. It wasn't much to look at, just a low stone ring capped with a corrugated metal cover and a padlock older than most folks on the HOA board. But to me, it was sacred. Granddad used to say, that well's deeper than secrets and older than lies. Treat it with respect, and it'll never fail you. And it never had. Through blackouts, droughts, and hurricanes, it kept running. Cold, steady, reliable, just like he was. When I came back to this house after retiring from 22 years in the Corps, the well was one of the few things that hadn't changed. The neighborhood around it, though, that was a different story. When I was a kid, this land was part of an unincorporated ranch zone. No fences, no covenants, no Karens with clipboards peering over your hedges. But 20 years and a housing boom later, developers moved in like termites, and with them came Stone Hollow Estates and their pride and joy, the Stone Hollow HOA. At first, I didn't care. My property was grandfathered in. I didn't have to pay dues, and they didn't have jurisdiction over my house, my porch, or my well. That's what the county deed said, and that's what I told them the day I moved back. But the HOA didn't like things they couldn't control, and they sure didn't like me being outside their rules. Still, for a few months, it was quiet. I kept to myself, fixed up the place, repaired the porch rail my daughter tripped over as a kid, repainted the shutters. I even let a few curious neighbors fill up buckets during the last dry spell when the county's water pressure dipped for 3 days. I'm not heartless. But then came the weekly visits. First, it was just Brad Whitmore, the HOA president, walking his designer dog a little too close to my fence. Then came the flyers about neighborhood integration and resource sharing. Then the knocks, always polite, always with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Merrick," he said one afternoon, standing in his loafers on my gravel driveway, "have you considered how much good your well could do if shared with the community during emergencies?" I leaned against the post, arms crossed. The well's on my land, paid for and maintained by my family for generations. That's not a community resource, Brad. That's private property. He smiled wider, the kind of smile you see from someone who's already decided they're right. Of course. I just figured you'd want to contribute. It's really about unity and resilience. Then maybe your HOA should have built a backup cistern before spending 30 grand on a pergola, I replied. His smile thinned. It's something we'll continue discussing. No rush. But there was always a rush with people like him. The HOA was like water, always finding a crack to seep into, patient but persistent. I shrugged it off at first. I'd dealt with worse than Brad Whitmore in my life. The Corps teaches you to ignore the buzzing of petty tyrants. But something about his tone stayed with me. The way he looked at that well like it was already his. The next week, I found a notice taped to my gate. Not a legal order, not a city mandate. Just a folded HOA bulletin, passive-aggressive as ever. Dear resident, in the spirit of community preparedness and equitable contribution, the board is formally requesting shared access to all privately held water sources within Stone Hollow Estates. Refusal to cooperate may result in escalated discussions or municipal review. It was signed with a flourish and a watermark I didn't recognize, some faux official seal with an eagle and a gavel. I laughed out loud, standing there in my driveway. That night, I pulled out the original land deed, still brittle and yellowed, and reread it for the 1,000th time. The property boundaries were crystal clear. My land wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. The well wasn't in dispute. Still, something twisted in my gut. I knew men like Brad didn't stop when they were told no. They just got sneakier. A week later, I came home from a trip into town and found the padlock on the well had been cleanly cut. Not forced, not mangled, just snipped like someone had the right tools and the time to do it quietly. I stood there staring at it, a low wind brushing past my neck. The metal cover was slightly ajar. Footprints, 2 sets, tracked across the dry earth, fresh enough that I could still see the tread patterns. Someone had been down there. I lifted the lid and peered into the shaft. The pump was still in place, but the insulation around the pipe was torn, and a new length of PVC had been added, branching off toward the property line, half buried and sloppy. They had tapped into my well. I didn't remember grabbing the phone. I don't even remember dialing. But my hand was clenched around it when I heard the HOA's voicemail, calm and saccharine. This is Stone Hollow Estates. Please leave your name, address, and the nature of your concern. I didn't leave a message. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started documenting everything. Photos of the broken lock, close-ups of the new pipe, time-stamped video. I even took a soil sample near the tampered trench. Old habits die hard, and I wasn't about to be gaslit by a group of bored retirees with delusions of legal authority. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, because I was angry. Because they'd crossed a line that ran deeper than any well. Because they didn't know what they'd just woken up. Because I'd warned them. And because that old land, it remembers. The morning after I discovered the tampered lock and illegal piping, I drove straight to the county records office with a file folder under my arm and a headache behind my eyes. 22 years in the Marines taught me never to accuse without proof, and I'd already printed the photos from last night, annotated them, and included a copy of my deed highlighting the section that stated my property was excluded from HOA jurisdiction. I even flagged the well's coordinates. The woman at the desk, Margaret, had silver hair and reading glasses that dangled from a beaded chain. When I laid the file down in front of her, she raised one eyebrow. "HOA trouble?" she asked without looking up. "How'd you guess?" She snorted. "Stone Hollow. They've had their noses in everyone's business lately. 2 weeks ago, they tried to demand landscaping changes from a couple who live half a mile outside their boundary line." I nodded slowly. "Can you verify the easement on my parcel, and if anything's changed in the last 6 months?" She slid the folder toward herself, punched a few keys on her keyboard, and tilted her glasses up. "Let's see. Nope. You're still carved out. Land deed dated 1971. Transferred to your name in 2006. No shared water utility agreement on file. You're clean, Mr. Merrick." "Thanks," I said. "Can I get that in writing?" Margaret smirked, already printing. I walked out of the building with a manila envelope tucked under one arm, and a resolve forming in my chest like a loaded spring. I wasn't just going to let them poke and prod their way into my property. They wanted a war over a well fine. But I wasn't going to fight it their way behind closed doors and neighborly whispers. I was going to do it by the book. That night, I wrote a formal cease and desist notice citing trespassing property damage and unlawful redirection of a private utility. I attached the evidence and delivered it to the HOA office the next morning, a small brick-walled bungalow that smelled like old printer toner and too much perfume. Nobody looked me in the eye when I dropped off the envelope. I should have known they wouldn't respond in kind. 3 days later, I got their answer. It wasn't a reply to my letter. It was a new one, thicker, on faux letterhead, with a gold-embossed seal that probably cost more than they paid for their legal advice. The envelope was hand-delivered and slipped under my door without a knock. I opened it slowly. Inside were 5 pages of carefully worded nonsense. "Dear Mr. Merrick, this letter serves as official notice that the Stone Hollow Estates Homeowners Association is asserting limited provisional access to natural resources located within its operational boundaries in accordance with the Community Utility Emergency Allocation Bylaws ratified on May 4, 2019. Your privately held well has been designated a critical emergency resource. Effective immediately and pending final approval from the Resource Allocation Subcommittee, it will serve as a backup supply during high-demand periods or regional shortages. Please refrain from impeding further development or infrastructure related to this shared access point. Doing so may be construed as obstruction of community welfare and referred to the County Mediation Board. Sincerely, Bradley Whitmore, HOA President, Stone Hollow Estates." I stared at the last line for a long time. Obstruction of community welfare. They were twisting the language like a rope around my neck, inventing bylaws, citing subcommittees that probably didn't exist. And the worst part? It sounded official enough that a regular neighbor wouldn't question it. But I wasn't just any neighbor. The following morning, I drove back to the HOA office and demanded a face-to-face meeting. They told me I could attend the next open board session in 2 weeks. 2 weeks while they continued to run their unauthorized pipeline siphon off my water and spread lies about shared access. No, that wouldn't stand. I posted a laminated copy of my property deed and the cease and desist letter on the pump house door. I put up trail cams in the trees aimed directly at the well. I installed a digital flow meter on the line inside the pump enclosure so I could track any unauthorized draw. I wasn't playing games anymore, but the HOA was already moving fast. By Friday, I noticed a new construction permit taped to a wooden stake 2 lots away, right on the boundary, where their pipe had run through my land. The permit was vague, referencing hydro infrastructure augmentation, but I recognized the contractor's logo. I'd seen their trucks the night I found the cut lock. They were building a distribution valve, likely underground, to hide it. They weren't just stealing water. They were integrating it into the neighborhood system. I drove to the contractor's local office and requested the full permit application. The receptionist looked nervous, and for good reason. The application had my coordinates listed as the source intake, not city water, not a rain harvesting tank, my well. When I asked who signed off on the paperwork, she handed me a copy. At the bottom, in perfect cursive, was the signature I expected, Bradley Whitmore. My blood boiled. I wasn't some recluse on a hill. I wasn't confused about my rights. I'd spent my life serving this country, and now I was being robbed legally, publicly, and with the smug blessing of a man who'd never worked a day outside an air-conditioned HOA office. I left that office with the document in hand and drove straight to the city zoning department. The clerk there, an overworked guy named Marcus, took one look at the permit and frowned. "This shouldn't have been approved," he muttered. "There's no utility easement. The intake point is on privately deeded land not listed under HOA jurisdiction. Did you authorize this?" "No," I said flatly, "and I can prove it." He shook his head. "Give me 24 hours. I'll escalate this." By the time I got back home, the first neighbor had come by. She was polite, even apologetic. Her name was Sandra. She lived 2 streets over and had just moved in. She said her water had tasted a little off lately, and someone told her the HOA was testing a new emergency well system. "That wouldn't happen to be your well, would it?" she asked sheepishly. I nodded slowly. "Is it okay if we're using it?" "No," I said, not unkindly. "It isn't, and you shouldn't have to rely on it." She looked shocked. "But they said you donated it." I almost laughed. Did they now? It wasn't just about water anymore. It was about truth, about control. The HOA had built an entire narrative around their theft. Community access, emergency preparedness, donated resources, all lies. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on my porch with a thermos of black coffee and stared at the pump house, wondering just how deep this thing would go. I didn't realize then that the answer was literally underground. The water pressure had changed not just in people's homes, but beneath the earth. I could feel it in my boots, like something shifting under the skin of the land. And I knew even then, they were messing with something older than their bylaws, and something was going to give. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of clear blue sky morning that always made me feel like I was back at Camp Pendleton, where the calm was never to be trusted. I was splitting logs behind the house when I noticed the birds had gone silent. Not all at once, but gradually, like they knew something was off. The air had that heaviness you feel before a summer storm, except there wasn't a single cloud above me. I stepped out from behind the shed and scanned the horizon, and that's when I saw them. 2 HOA trucks, white Fords with the green and gold Stone Hollow logo stenciled on the sides, parked just off the gravel road near the edge of my property. A third truck, unmarked but newer, idled beside them. 3 men stood around the wellhead, one of them kneeling prying at the lid with a crowbar. Another one was looking at a clipboard. Brad wasn't there, but I recognized the Vice President Greg Short guy, barrel-chested, wore sunglasses like he was in the Secret Service. I grabbed my phone and started filming as I walked toward them. "You're on private property," I called out, my voice calm but sharp. "You've got 5 seconds to explain what the hell you're doing." The guy with the crowbar froze. Greg turned, gave me the kind of practiced smile that only comes with arrogance and liability insurance. "Mr. Merrick," he said. "Good morning. Just doing some infrastructure assessment." I kept walking. "Without a warrant, without a permit, you know damn well that well isn't yours." He didn't flinch. "We have provisional community rights under the HOA emergency bylaw. That bylaw doesn't override a county-registered deed. He motioned to the clipboard. We're just making sure the system is operational. It's not personal. Oh, it's personal, I said, stepping between them and the well. Because I already said no. And yet here you are with bolt cutters and trespass boots. He sighed like I was being unreasonable. Look, Mr. Merrick, nobody wants this to escalate. We've got dozens of residents depending on this resource now. That's your problem, not mine. He lowered his sunglasses just enough for me to see the glint in his eyes. Careful. That kind of attitude can look like obstruction. I laughed once, sharp, cold. You want to see obstruction, I asked, pulling out the court summons I'd picked up that morning. This is a temporary restraining order filed with the zoning office. As of 9:00 a.m. today, any alteration access or tampering with my property is prohibited by law. Greg's smile dropped. You're bluffing. Try me. I stepped aside just enough for the camera on my phone to catch a clear shot of all three men, the trucks. The tools, now wave for the court. Greg swore under his breath, yanked his radio off his belt, and started mumbling into it. They left after that, not quickly but reluctantly, like they didn't want to look like they were retreating. I stood there until the last truck rolled out of sight, then locked the wellhead again with a new tamper-proof bolt I'd picked up from the supply store. I checked the trail cams, confirmed they had recorded everything, and backed it all up to the cloud. I even sent a copy to Marcus at the city zoning office. Still, I didn't feel victorious, just uneasy. Because if they'd come this far, cutting locks, trespassing in broad daylight, what would they try next? That night, the pressure gauge on my digital monitor spiked at 2:18 a.m. I was awake, sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a mug of reheated coffee, when the alert pinged. I rushed out with a flashlight and found the flow meter ticking higher than it should have been, even though the well wasn't actively drawing. That meant backflow. Someone had turned on a connection downstream and was trying to siphon water. Not from the top, but from the auxiliary pipe they'd spliced in below. I ran to the access hatch by the fence line where I'd marked the spot weeks ago, and sure enough, the soil was wet. Not rain wet, pooled, saturated. Something had ruptured underground, and it wasn't on my side of the line. The next morning, I filed a police report. Trespassing, illegal tapping of a private utility, criminal damage to infrastructure. The deputy, an older man named Tully, looked over my documentation and whistled low. Damn thorough, he said, flipping through the photos. If half the folks in town kept records like this, we'd have less courtroom drama. I don't want drama, I muttered. I want them off my land. He nodded, chewing on his pen. This might take a few weeks. You're not the first one to complain about Stone Hollow, but they've got lawyers stacked high as their fences. I'm not scared of fences. No, he said, looking up at me. You're not. That night, the HOA fired back. An official email sent to me and CC'd to every homeowner in Stone Hollow with the subject line. Community alert, unstable water source, identified, caution advised. It was full of insinuations. Recent shifts in water quality may be related to unregulated use of outdated private systems. Residents are encouraged to report any suspicious activity around water sources. HOA leadership remains committed to public safety and accountability. And just like that, they'd flipped the narrative. Now I was the danger. Now Well, the one they illegally tapped was being blamed for contamination and instability. I paced the living room, fists, clenched phone burning hot in my hand. I started drafting a response, then deleted it. Started again. Deleted that too. No. This wasn't going to be one with angry emails or neighborhood gossip. This was bigger now. Because that backflow wasn't just a leak. It was pressure. Pressure under the surface. And if they kept forcing water through those old geological channels like they were pushing through red tape, something would give. Not just in court, but in the earth itself. And when it did, it wouldn't just flood lawns or soak basements. It would swallow everything. I've always believed that land has a language subtle, ancient, and exact. You just have to know how to listen. And right now, the soil beneath Stone Hollow was screaming. After the backflow incident, I couldn't shake the unease. It settled into my bones like a damp chill. Something about the pressure changes the sudden pooling water, the shifting texture of the soil underfoot. It wasn't just sabotage. It was structural. The ground itself was reacting. So I went digging. Not literally, not yet, but through paper, old paper, the kind that smells like mildew and bureaucracy. I drove to the county archives in the next town over where they kept geological surveys dating back to the 1940s. The clerk, a lanky kid with a nose ring and chipped nail polish, pointed me to a side room stacked floor to ceiling with filing cabinets and dusty cardboard boxes. "Good luck," he said as if I were heading into a crypt. I found what I needed in a cracked binder labeled Aquatic Stone County, 1957-1973. Inside were topographic overlays, hydrology logs, and a map that sent a ripple down my spine. Underneath the land that would later become Stone Hollow sat an unstable limestone shelf. According to the survey, it was riddled with natural fissures, soft pockets, and underground rivulets fed by shifting aquifers. One particular note from 1968, scrawled in fading blue ink, caught my eye. Unadvised to drill below 90 ft in this zone. Water pressure erratic. Evidence of previous subsurface collapse. That was nearly the exact depth of my well. My grandfather must have known. Maybe that's why he reinforced the shaft with concrete sleeves and installed a manual shutoff valve most modern systems didn't bother with. He wasn't just building a well, he was fortifying a pressure valve for the entire land. And now the HOA had tapped into it, rerouted it, pressurized it. They had no idea what they were doing. I took photos of the survey, photocopied the maps, and made a detour to the county's Environmental Risk Assessment Office. A woman named Ava Lynn met with me after I explained the urgency. She was a hydrologist, sharp-eyed and serious, and she took one look at the geology charts and frowned deeply. "You said they rerouted an existing well into a community system. Without a permit," I added. Her brow furrowed. "That's dangerous. Those old limestone pockets act like sponges until they don't. You introduce pressure from an external system, especially one that cycles volume inconsistently, and the ground can literally dissolve underneath. Sinkholes, or worse," she said. "Subterranean flooding, erosion, collapse, lateral fractures. If the network connects to other fault lines, say near storm drainage or septic systems, it could destabilize large sections." I asked if she'd issue an official notice. "I can't without a site inspection," she replied. "But if you invite us onto your land and we see direct evidence of disturbance, I can file an emergency report. You'll have that invitation by tomorrow morning," I promised. Back at home, I went straight to the old root cellar behind the pump house, a narrow concrete chamber built into the hill. That's where the auxiliary piping had been spliced. I opened the hatch and climbed down slowly, flashlight in one hand, my other brushing the wall for support. The floor was damp. The concrete felt brittle beneath my boots. I shone the light at the elbow joint they'd installed PVC and aluminum bolted into my original copper fitting and spotted a hairline crack at the seal. Worse, the back wall had a long, jagged split running vertically from floor to ceiling. Water glistened along it, seeping, breathing. I stepped back, heart racing. The ground was under pressure, not just figuratively, but literally. They'd tampered with the old equilibrium. What had once been a stable vertical draw was now a forced lateral system pushing water into channels never meant to carry it. The limestone would dissolve, the clay would collapse, and whatever sat above homes, lawns, driveways would follow. I climbed out fast and locked the hatch. I didn't sleep that night. I just watched the pressure readings on my phone spike every few hours like a heartbeat climbing toward cardiac arrest. By morning, the HOA had plastered new signs along the main road. "Emergency water relief system operational thanks to our community contributors." Contributors, that's what they called theft now. I called Ava again. She agreed to visit that afternoon. She arrived with 2 assistants and a truck full of portable sonar equipment. We spent 3 hours surveying the root cellar, the wellhead, and the trench where the unauthorized pipe led out. The readings were worse than expected. "A cavity's forming," she told me, pointing to the screen. "Looks like a subterranean pool has developed under the east ridge. If pressure increases, the surface could depress or collapse entirely." "Under HOA land?" I asked. She nodded grimly, specifically under their new clubhouse. I didn't feel triumphant, just sick. Because this wasn't a slow erosion. This was a ticking clock. I asked how long we had. "Depends on water draw, rainfall, soil saturation. Could be weeks, could be days." She filed the emergency report that night and sent copies to the city, the county, and the HOA. I posted a copy on my front gate right beside the laminated deed. The next morning, HOA board members came to my property. All of them. Brad in his 2 white polo shirt. Greg in mirrored sunglasses. A few others I didn't recognize. They didn't knock. just waited by the fence like vultures in a homeowner's parade. I walked out slowly, arms folded. Brad held a letter in one hand. "We received a concerning report, Mr. Merrick." "That so," I said. "You mean the geological warning about the disaster you idiots are brewing under your own feet?" He didn't flinch. "This letter is a cease and desist. You're interfering with HOA operations, making false reports, and attempting to undermine community trust." I took it from his hand, glanced at the letterhead, and then tore it clean in half. "This land's older than your fake bylaws," I said, "and it's going to teach you a lesson the hard way." Brad opened his mouth, but then from deep below, we all felt it. A low thump, subtle, like a drum beat beneath the soles of our shoes. The ground shifted slightly, just enough to make the nearby birdbath tremble, and a few pebbles roll from my porch step. Brad's face paled. "Was that?" "That," I said, turning back toward the well, "was your warning, and you only get one." The next 24 hours passed with a kind of eerie silence I hadn't felt since my second tour in Kandahar. When we knew something was about to blow, we just didn't know when. The HOA board left my property without another word after the tremor, but their expressions told me everything I needed to know. They weren't going to back down. They were going to double down. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table in the dark, the only light coming from the soft blue glow of the digital pressure monitor mounted on the wall beside the back door. It was calm, too calm. No draw, no spikes, no surges. It stayed steady at baseline for 6 straight hours. And that's what made my stomach twist, because it meant they weren't pulling from the original access point anymore. They were up to something else. At 3:14 a.m., the motion alert from the Western Trail cam pinged my phone. I opened the app and froze. 2 men in hard hats, reflective vests, and headlamps were standing in the trench near the fence line. They weren't just checking the line, they were cutting it. And they weren't using the auxiliary pipe anymore. They were digging into the main well line itself. I threw on my boots and grabbed my flashlight. But by the time I got outside and made it halfway across the yard, the trucks were already pulling away, taillights disappearing around the corner like cockroaches fleeing the light. I jogged to the pump house and swung the door open. The piping inside had been rerouted. My copper main had been cut and capped, and a brand new manifold system, one of those industrial-grade PVC nodes with multiple valves and directional regulators, had been installed in its place. The thing was bolted to my floor like it belonged there, with brand new serial numbers and yellow tags from a private utility contractor I didn't recognize. They'd literally built a distribution hub inside my pump house. Overnight. My hands shook with rage. This wasn't trespassing anymore. This was full-on infrastructure theft. They weren't just using my water, they were integrating it, embedding it, into a broader network as if I didn't exist. I yanked open the flow regulator and followed the new line. It disappeared underground, veering sharply southward directly toward the HOA's newly constructed clubhouse where the so-called emergency resource station had recently opened. I stormed back inside and called the sheriff's department. Again. Deputy Tully picked up on the third ring, his voice groggy but alert. "They replumbed my system," I said. "They're drawing water directly from my well through a full-scale distribution setup inside my building, without consent." He cursed under his breath. "Jesus, Merrick. They're escalating." "Not just them," I said. "The land is too." By sunrise, Ava Lynn had returned with her team. We spent the morning scanning deeper sonar and thermal imaging this time, focusing on the area between my land and the HOA's clubhouse. The results came in fast. "We've got a subterranean cavity," she said, pointing to the screen. "About 8 feet below grade, roughly the size of a 2-car garage and growing. Water flow from your well is funneling directly into it. The pressure is dissolving the limestone." "How long?" She hesitated. "Hours, days, depends on the load." At 10:07 a.m., a crack appeared in the asphalt near the Stone Hollow clubhouse's rear lot. I saw it myself when I drove by, documenting the perimeter. Just a thin fissure at first, but it was wet, glossy. And by the time I passed it again at noon, it had grown into a shallow depression 6 feet wide. I emailed the photos to the zoning department, the city planning commission, and because I was done playing defense, the local news station. I titled the email, "HOA steals water and the ground responds." An hour later, the HOA responded the only way they knew how. I was working on bracing the pump house door when I heard tires crunch on gravel. Not one vehicle, 3. 2 HOA trucks, and a third one bearing a private security logo I didn't recognize. They walked onto my land like they owned it. Brad Gregg and a security guy in a navy blazer who looked like he was born scowling. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be," Brad said, arms crossed, voice oily. I didn't say anything. Gregg stepped forward. "We've issued a temporary annexation clause. Section 12C of the emergency bylaws grants us authority over shared assets in times of environmental stress." "You mean the stress you caused," I replied. The security guard handed me an envelope. "You're being cited for obstruction of emergency infrastructure. Interference with public utility expansion." I laughed. I couldn't help it. The sound was bitter and hollow. Public utility. This is my goddamn well. Gregg's lip curled. "Not anymore. You've failed to maintain a safe structure. The board voted unanimously to absorb it for the community." "You don't absorb a private well," I snapped. "You stole it, and the land is going to teach you a lesson for it." Brad leaned in. "That sounds like a threat, Daniel." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Because just then, a deep rumble echoed across the field. Not thunder, not machinery. Something lower, subtle, like the earth exhaling after holding its breath too long. The security guard stepped back suddenly, unsure. Gregg looked around, nervous. I turned to Brad. "Still want to own it?" They left in a hurry. Later that afternoon, I was working on bypassing the manifold when a neighbor I barely knew, Harold, mid-40s, lived near the clubhouse, knocked on my door, wide-eyed and frantic. "Something's happening," he said. "The ground in my backyard. It's soft. My shed's leaning. I think it's sinking." I followed him back and saw it with my own eyes, a subtle dip forming under his grass, almost like the earth was folding inward. Water seeped up around the edges like blood from a wound. He looked at me pale. "They said you gave them the..." "Well," he whispered. "They said it was safe." I looked at the dip, the moisture, the trembling shadow under the shed's concrete pad. They lied. That evening, I sent a final email, not to the HOA, but to the city's Department of Public Works, Ava's office, and every journalist I could find within a 50-mile radius. It contained 2 things. 1. A time-stamped video of the rerouted piping with GPS overlays and my property deed displayed clearly. 2. The updated geological scan showing a growing cavity with direct correlation to the HOA's new water network. The subject line read, "HOA Sinkhole in progress, engineered by HOA theft." Then I sat on the porch, just like my grandfather used to, watching the land breathe. And in the far distance, where the earth met the edge of Stone Hollow's newest pride and joy, the clubhouse lights flickered once, then again, then darkness. The first complaints came in around dawn. I heard them drifting across the breeze, confused voices, garden hoses, sputtering sprinklers, stuttering in slow coughing bursts. Someone shouted, "It's Brown," from across the road. A few minutes later, I got a knock on the door. It was Sandra again, the neighbor who'd asked me weeks ago if the HOA had my permission to use the well. Her hair was damp, pulled back in a bun, and her eyes were wide with panic. "There's no water," she said. "I mean, there is, but it's..." She held up a clear gallon jug filled with liquid the color of steeped tobacco. "It smells like rust, like sulfur. What is this?" I took it from her, opened the cap, and sniffed. It wasn't just rust. It was ancient water, the kind trapped in pockets below the limestone, rich in iron sediment and microbial bloom. The kind that should never have been tapped without proper filtration or geological containment. The kind that signaled something below had ruptured. "How long's it been like this?" I asked. "Since this morning." But the pressure dropped last night. A bunch of people posted about it on the neighborhood app. Of course they had. The HOA might have lied about where the water came from, but they couldn't hide the consequences. The system they'd spliced together was cannibalizing itself. My well, designed to feed one household, had been pulled, strained, overworked, and rerouted so many times that it was now dredging up sediment from levels it was never meant to reach. It wasn't a resource anymore. It was a warning sign. "I wouldn't drink it," I told her gently, "not even boiled." She looked horrified. "My son made oatmeal with it." I handed her a fresh jug of bottled water from my emergency stash and promised to drop off more later. As she left, I could already hear the rumble of HOA trucks weaving through the streets trying to look official. One of them slowed as it passed my house, and for the first time in weeks, they didn't stop. They didn't threaten. They just kept going, like they knew what was coming. I checked my pressure monitor. The gauge was erratic, climbing and falling in bursts like a dying heartbeat. I switched over to the auxiliary sensor Ava had helped install last week. It showed a more terrifying truth. The draw wasn't coming from the community anymore. The well was pulling itself dry, like something beneath had opened its throat and swallowed the entire shaft. I sent Ava a message. Within an hour, she was back at the site with a portable water analyzer and a look on her face I didn't like. "It's leaching," she said. "What? Your aquifer's been compromised. When they tapped into the lower channels, they must have fractured the natural clay seal. The water's moving sideways now, not up. It's collapsing back into the limestone basin. How long before it's dry?" She didn't answer. We stood in silence as she lowered a sensor into the shaft. The screen flashed numbers I didn't understand at pressure, depth, velocity, but I didn't need to read them. I could feel it. The well was dying. A few hours later, the HOA issued their first official statement in over a week. Not to me, of course, to the community. They posted it on every mailbox, every bulletin board, and every corner post near the walking trail. Temporary water service interruption due to unforeseen geological event. Dear Stone Hollow residents, due to an unexpected shift in the underground water supply system, residents may experience reduced pressure discoloration or temporary outages. We are working closely with environmental consultants to assess the situation and restore services promptly. We appreciate your patience and continued trust in the HOA's emergency management protocols. No apology, no ownership, just vague deflection and corporate jargon. But this time it didn't work, because the water wasn't just slow, it was gone. By sunset, faucets across Stone Hollow coughed nothing but air. I heard the panic start in pockets, parents shouting at each other, neighbors arguing over jugs from Costco, HOA reps handing out bottled water with forced smiles and plastic gloves. But the fear was spreading faster than the damage, because it wasn't just about inconvenience anymore. It was about collapse. I stood near the pump house as Ava's team packed up their gear. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in 2 days. "You were right," she said quietly. This whole land was balanced on a knife's edge, and they stomped right through it. I stared at the well. I'd always thought it would outlive me. Thought it would be the one thing I could pass on that hadn't been corrupted, polluted, or paved over. It wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was my grandfather's hands, my father's sweat, my childhood summers, and now it was bleeding out. Later that night, Greg showed up. Alone. No HOA trucks, no clipboard, just a flashlight and a face gone pale. "I shouldn't be here," he said as I opened the door. "Then why are you?" He looked down at his hands. They were trembling. "The ground behind the clubhouse, it's sinking. Not all at once, but slowly, like it's breathing." "It is," I told him. "That's what happens when you mess with things older than you understand." He swallowed. "Brad's talking about blaming you in front of the city council. He says you sabotaged the infrastructure, that you created instability on purpose. And you?" Greg hesitated. I don't believe him anymore. We stood in silence, the hum of crickets rising in the distance. "I need your help," he finally said. "Not the board, me." I crossed my arms. "Why?" "Because I live here too. And I've got 2 kids. And right now they're brushing their teeth with bottled water and asking me why the sidewalk in front of our house is cracking." I let that hang in the air. Then I said, "If you really want to help, bring me HOA's original contractor documents. Everything you've signed, every permit, every map. You do that and I'll show the city what's actually happening." He nodded once, then again. "I'll bring them," he said, "tomorrow." He left without another word, and I sat on the porch in the dark again, watching the distant glow of porch lights flicker off one by one. The community had mocked my well. They'd taken it without respect. And now the land was reclaiming what was hers, one pipe at a time. I remember the sound before anything else. Not a boom, not a crash, but a low yawning groan, like the land itself was sighing after years of being ignored. It came at 4:41 a.m., just before first light from the direction of the HOA clubhouse. At first, I thought it was a passing truck or maybe distant thunder. But then I heard the screaming. I threw on a shirt and rushed out the door. Sandra was already in the street, barefoot, wrapped in a robe, clutching her phone in both hands. "It's happening," she whispered, staring down the road. "Daniel, look." I followed her gaze. The western ridge, the one where the HOA had laid its prized clubhouse, complete with a gazebo fountain and parking lot lined with brick pavers, was no longer flat. A depression had formed near the back where the storm drain connected with their new water distribution hub. The brick was cracking. The fountain tilted at a nauseating angle, and a ring of standing water had pooled around its base like the edge of a sinkhole waiting to give. I ran to my truck tires spinning on loose gravel and reached the site in under 3 minutes. Several homeowners had already gathered, standing a cautious distance away, phones' raised voices hushed with awe and terror. Then, without ceremony, the ground dropped 6 inches. It wasn't sudden like in the movies. It was worse, slow and deliberate. A groan became a rumble. Pavers shifted like teeth grinding in an old jaw. One of the wooden benches on the lawn began to slide, legs tilting forward as it disappeared inch by inch into a widening mouth of clay and broken rock. Someone shouted, "It's the well," and I turned toward them. It was Brad. Of course it was. His face was red, his voice panicked, and for once the tailored confidence he always wore, like armor, had cracked. "This is his fault," he bellowed, pointing toward me. "He's the one who manipulated the aquifer. This is sabotage." I stepped forward slowly, hands raised, heart pounding, not with fear, but with fury. "You tapped a private well without permission. You rerouted flow against geological advice. You ignored every warning, every regulation, every expert. You think I caused this." Brad didn't back down. "You falsified reports, poisoned the system. You weakened the structural base." I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. The pressure monitor app glowed to life, showing the last 72 hours of flow data, including the spike that occurred when the HOA switched their entire system over to my well's main. "Want to explain why your board authorized a full pressure draw through a 70-year-old shaft not rated for municipal capacity?" He didn't answer. So I turned the phone toward the crowd. "Because I've got the documents, the data, the footage, and the contractor signatures." I held up the envelope Greg had dropped off 2 hours earlier, proving you knew this would happen. Brad's face twisted. "Greg's a liar." "Greg's scared," I replied, "like all of you should be." And then, as if on cue, the clubhouse itself groaned. The southwest corner, the one nearest the buried water intake system, lurched downward with a snapping noise so loud it silenced the entire crowd. A crack tore across the outer wall like a lightning bolt, jagged and wet, and the roof above the gazebo let out a tortured screech before splitting in two. People screamed and backed away. Someone fell. Another man grabbed a child and bolted toward the street. A car alarm blared from somewhere deeper in the development. The earth buckled. And then, in one sickening moment, the rear third of the HOA clubhouse slid forward and disappeared. It didn't explode. It didn't burst. It sank. Straight down into a widening crater the size of a swimming pool. Mud, concrete, and shredded insulation vanished like sand pulled through a drain. Water gushed from below in a geyser, brown and foaming, as though the earth itself was spitting their arrogance back in their faces. I heard Brad choke on a breath. "Oh my God," someone muttered. The crowd turned to me, not in accusation now, but in realization. "You tried to warn them," Sandra said quietly. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. Later that day, the city barricaded the entire west end of the neighborhood. Engineers in neon vests and hard hats arrived with drones and soil probes. News vans parked along the main road, their satellite dishes scanning the sky like vultures scenting a story. The local news aired a segment that night. "Sinkhole destroys HOA clubhouse. Illegal well system to blame." The footage showed the crater, the collapsed roof, the damaged vehicles half submerged in muck. Then they cut to an interview clip of me on the street arms, crossed eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "It wasn't an accident," I said. "It was engineered. They thought they could control the land, use it, rewire it. But some things don't work that way. Some things fight back." By morning, the phone calls started. The mayor's office, the city zoning board, the environmental council, and the sheriff. Because now it wasn't just a civil matter. Now it was criminal. They raided the HOA office at noon. Confiscated files, computers, contractor payment logs. Turns out Brad had bypassed safety inspections and signed off on forged environmental clearance forms. The permit I'd found weeks ago, the one claiming my well, was donated falsified, notarized under a suspended license. Greg came to see me again that evening. He looked 10 years older than when we last spoke. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" "For being quiet." I nodded. "I didn't think it'd get this bad," he added. "It's not over yet." That night, I stood at the edge of the sinkhole behind the yellow caution tape as engineers lowered a camera probe into the abyss. One of them turned to me and said, "It's hollow underneath, spans almost 30 feet. How far does it go?" I asked. He shrugged. Hard to say. But if this whole area shares the same aquifer and they opened a breach. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I turned and looked back toward the rest of Stone Hollow rows of neat lawns, smiling porches, white fences. And beneath it all, cracks. Waiting. The well wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was the wound. And now everyone could feel it. By the following morning, they'd plastered my name all over the neighborhood message board. The post was anonymous, but everyone knew who wrote it. Probably Brad, maybe with Greg's help if he'd fallen back into line. It was riddled with legal-sounding threats and vague accusations, but one sentence stood out like a bloodstain on white carpet. "It is the opinion of several board members that Mr. Daniel Merrick's actions directly endangered the safety of our community." I stared at it, jaw-tight, blood roaring in my ears. They'd buried a clubhouse, contaminated an aquifer, routed a private well without permission, lied on permits, and now they were trying to pin it on me. I should have expected it. When the powerful lose control, they don't admit guilt. They look for a scapegoat. And if that scapegoat happens to be the guy who's been warning them for weeks, who owns the well at the center of the storm, who stood his ground while they played God well, that just makes the narrative cleaner. But I wasn't going to be their fall guy. Not this time. That afternoon, the city called. A councilwoman named Rebecca Talbot, who I'd only met once during a town hall years back, left a voicemail asking if I'd be willing to speak at an emergency session scheduled for the next morning. "We're trying to get a full picture," she said, her voice tight and formal. "Your name has come up frequently." I didn't hesitate. Yes, I told her when I called back. "And I'll bring everything." I spent the rest of the day organizing the file. It wasn't just a manila envelope anymore. It had grown into a full binder, time-stamped pressure readings, contractor invoices, hydrology scans, survey overlays, photos, emails, letters, even the footage from my trail cams of those midnight pipe jobs. I printed copies, backed them up twice, and wrote a timeline on legal-sized paper from the first HOA visit to the sinkhole collapse. I didn't sleep that night, not out of fear, but because I knew this was the moment. This was when I either reclaimed my name or lost it entirely. The emergency session was held at the city council chambers, but they moved it to the auditorium next door to fit the crowd. News vans lined the street. Homeowners sat in folding chairs, some with arms crossed, others holding bottles of water like totems of the crisis. Brad was there too, wearing a pressed shirt and that same tight-lipped smile he always used when he thought he could manipulate the room. A lawyer stood beside him, whispering in his ear. When they called me up to speak, I carried the binder in both hands and walked to the front of the room like I was carrying a case file into a courtroom. Which, in a way, I was. I stood at the podium, met the eyes of every council member, and began. "My name is Daniel Merrick. I'm a veteran, a homeowner, and the legal owner of the well at the center of this crisis, a well that has been in my family for over 70 years. What happened to this community did not begin with a sinkhole. It began with arrogance." I opened the binder and handed a copy of the deed to the clerk. "This is the original deed to my land, excluding me from HOA jurisdiction." I passed along the pressure logs. These show draw readings from my well before and after the HOA's illegal connection. Note the spike after they rerouted their system into my main line. I handed over the hydrology scans Ava had prepared. This geological analysis, confirmed by 2 licensed hydrologists, shows that the aquifer beneath our neighborhood is unstable, and that tapping it without regulation would increase risk of soil collapse. I held up the contractor invoices. These signatures, obtained from the HOA's own subcontractors, confirm that Brad Whitmore approved unsanctioned infrastructure rerouting through my property without permit or notification. I paused, then looked up. And finally this, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a flash drive, is trail cam footage showing HOA representatives cutting the lock to my well and installing unauthorized piping 2 weeks before the first tremor. The room was dead silent. Brad's face was the color of paper. His lawyer leaned in, whispering faster now. I turned back to the council. "You can believe the story they've told, that I somehow engineered a geological disaster under my own home for no benefit. Or you can follow the facts, the data, the documents, and see what really happened. This wasn't sabotage. It was theft, and negligence, and hubris. The city engineer stood to speak next. "We've reviewed the data provided by Mr. Merrick," he said, holding up his own binder. "It corroborates our preliminary findings. The sinkhole originated beneath a compromised portion of limestone due to increased lateral flow pressure caused by redirected water systems connected to a single overdrawn well. A well that was never meant to support this level of usage." The final blow came from Ava. She walked to the front and laid her credentials on the record years of hydrological research published. White Paper's state licensure then said, "We warned the HOA board about the instability. We advised against any further development until the pressure stabilized. They ignored that advice. Mr. Merrick didn't cause the sinkhole. He tried to prevent it. That was when the tide turned. It didn't happen all at once, but I could feel the shift in posture, in energy, in silence." Some of the homeowners lowered their arms. Others nodded slowly, shame creeping across their expressions. Even Sandra, sitting in the back row with her son on her lap, gave me the faintest of smiles. The councilwoman looked at Brad. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "do you have a response?" His lawyer stood instead. "We invoke our right to a formal hearing." Of course they did. But the damage was done. The city ordered an independent audit of the HOA's infrastructure. They froze all ongoing projects, and they assigned a temporary municipal overseer to review board decisions. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a beginning. Outside after the meeting, neighbors approached me one by one. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, a man I barely knew, eyes downcast. "I believed them," a woman whispered, tears brimming. "You were right," someone else said. "You were always right." I didn't gloat. I didn't snap back. I just nodded. Because that's what the land had taught me. When the ground finally opens and swallows the lies, what you're left with isn't victory. It's clarity. And sometimes that's enough. The trial wasn't a flashy affair. There were no cameras in the courtroom, no jury gasps or shouted confessions like in the movies. Just fluorescent lighting, tired clerks, and the slow grind of accountability clawing its way through layers of legal molasses. But for me, for the community, it was monumental. Brad Whitmore arrived in a suit 2 shades too crisp, still clinging to the illusion of control. Beside him sat 2 HOA board members and their attorney, a smug man with a Bluetooth earpiece and a silver tie that looked like it cost more than my monthly pension. They spoke in hushed tones, flipping through binders filled with carefully curated half-truths. I sat behind the plaintiff's table, flanked by Ava Lynn and the city's appointed legal counsel, a soft-spoken woman named Renee Nguyen, whose calm demeanor masked a steel-trap intellect. My binder, the same one I'd built piece by piece, sleepless night after sleepless night, sat open in front of me like a quiet sentinel. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with crow's feet and a gavel that didn't like being idle, called the hearing to order. City of Alder Creek versus Stone Hollow Estates Homeowners Association, she began. On the matter of illegal resource appropriation, falsification of environmental permits, and failure to disclose geological risks in civil development. The HOA's attorney stood first, arguing that the well had been informally integrated into community use during an emergency resource shortage, that I had verbally agreed to shared access, a lie, and that any geological instability was unforeseeable, possibly even accelerated by my unauthorized interference. Another lie. Renee Rose calmly turned to the court and said, "Your Honor, we have proof that the HOA board falsified permits, ignored licensed hydrological reports, and constructed unauthorized infrastructure on privately deeded land. We also have trail camera footage showing members of the HOA forcibly accessing Mr. Merrick's property, cutting through locks, and installing unauthorized piping into a water source never zoned for municipal use." She tapped the binder. "We also have corroborating testimony from environmental specialists and the city planning office, who were never informed of these changes, a violation of both state and local code." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Do you have the footage in question?" Renee nodded. "We do." It played on the courtroom monitor, grainy but clear enough. Greg's face visible, the cut lock, the unauthorized pipeline, the midnight modifications. The camera caught it all, including timestamps, weather overlays, and property boundary data. When the lights came back on, Brad stared straight ahead, lips pressed so tight they'd gone white. Then Ava testified. Her voice was steady as she explained the aquifer's fragility, the limestone fissures, the hydrostatic pressure buildup, and how Stone Hollow's water rerouting had created a hydraulic imbalance that triggered soil erosion. She described the subsurface cavities forming beneath multiple lots and warned that more collapses were possible if remediation wasn't immediate. The judge didn't interrupt once. Then it was my turn. I spoke not as a legal expert, but as a man who'd lived every second of this nightmare. I tried to warn them, I said, from day one. I gave them paperwork, geological scans, even invited them to meet with the county. Instead, they cut through my property, rerouted a 70-year-old system not built for high-volume draw, and ignored every expert who told them it was dangerous. I looked at the judge. I lost a piece of my family history when they killed that well. And this community, they almost lost more. Homes, safety, trust. There was no drama in my words, just truth. And the truth landed like weight on the room. When the hearing adjourned, the judge called for a recess before her final decision. We waited in the hallway, a line of tense shoulders and clenched fists. Greg passed by, without a word, eyes lowered, no longer smug, just tired. I couldn't tell if it was guilt or shame, but I didn't care anymore. I hadn't come for revenge. I'd come for the record. When the judge returned, her ruling was swift. The court finds Stone Hollow HOA liable for unauthorized use of private property negligence in civil development and misrepresentation of environmental conditions in their permit filings. The HOA is hereby ordered to pay damages to Mr. Daniel Merrick for unlawful access and infrastructure tampering, fund full environmental remediation under the supervision of an independent firm, submit to a city-appointed oversight committee for future development decisions, and immediately cease all use of the compromised well system. Brad's mouth opened, but the judge didn't give him room to speak. This is not a negotiation. This is restitution. With that, the gavel came down. After the hearing, several residents came to me in the parking lot. One handed me a handwritten apology. Another offered to help clean the debris still scattered around the sinkhole. But what mattered most came the next day. The city issued a formal takeover of the HOA's operational oversight, citing gross mismanagement and environmental endangerment. Brad resigned that afternoon. The board dissolved within a week. In their place, the city appointed a temporary neighborhood restoration committee and asked me if I'd serve as a liaison between them and the residents. I declined. I'm not a politician, I said, but I'll help rebuild. And I did. With Ava and a team of engineers, we resurveyed the land and drew up a new water safety plan, one that prioritized groundwater protection and banned any future community reliance on the well system. Sandra volunteered to coordinate supplies for residents affected by the outage. Even Greg joined the effort, quietly hauling gravel and filling sinkholes under Ava's direction. Ava stood beside me at the site of the collapsed clubhouse one afternoon, now nothing more than fenced-off rubble and caution tape. "You ever think about just leaving?" she asked. "All the time," I admitted. But I looked across the ridge at the rebuilt pipework, the restored drainage systems, the signs warning about unstable ground, and the kids laughing 2 blocks down, splashing in an above-ground pool filled with water trucked in from the city. "But this land remembers," I said, "and someone has to remember with it." She smiled and nodded. Later, I visited the old well one last time. It was sealed now, officially retired, a steel cap welded over the mouth, a plaque bolted to the side. It read, Merrick Wellesty, 1952. Retired, 2025, protected for future generations. Let history remind us that not all things are ours to control. I stood there in the golden light of dusk, hand on the plaque, the earth silent beneath my boots. It wasn't a victory, but it was peace. And for the first time in months, the ground didn't feel like it was waiting to fall out from under me. It felt still. When it was finally over, not just the hearings or the cleanup, but the weight of it all, I thought I'd feel relief. A sense of triumph, maybe. But what I felt instead was emptiness. Not loss, not grief. Just the absence of noise. Like after a storm, when the wind stops howling and you're left with broken branches, the smell of wet earth, and the stunned silence of survival. The HOA was gone. Their clubhouse reduced to twisted beams and red tape. Their bylaws, voided, retracted, archived in shame. Brad had moved out of the neighborhood quietly one night. No moving truck, no farewells, just gone. Some said he left for Arizona. Others whispered lawsuits were piling up one county over. I didn't care where he went. The land had already dealt with him. What mattered was what came next. The city formed a restoration task force to repair the damage, but it was the neighbors, the same ones who once stared at me with suspicion, who made the first real move. They knocked on my door with gloves, shovels, and even casseroles. Sandra brought a fresh jug of filtered water every week. Her son Liam helped repaint my porch steps without being asked. A retired math teacher named Mrs. Carson volunteered to organize a history of the land project, starting with an oral interview about the well. They didn't apologize outright, not most of them, but their presence was enough. Their effort was enough. It was like the neighborhood itself was trying to make amends. I helped Ava's team oversee the stabilization of the aquifer site. We filled the void under the collapsed clubhouse with engineered foam and clay barriers. The cracked sidewalks were repoured with proper drainage, and the rerouted storm lines were restored to their original channels. She even managed to secure funding for a community rainwater collection system above ground, properly filtered and safely maintained. A lesson learned. They asked me to cut the ribbon on it. I almost said no. But then Ava told me what they were going to call it. Merrick Commons. The name stopped me cold. Why, I asked her. Because it's about balance, she said. And you're the reason it was restored. I didn't argue. The ceremony was small. Just a handful of city officials, neighbors, and kids with juice boxes chasing each other between the fresh planters. I stood next to the new cistern tank ribbon stretched across 2 posts and held the scissors with hands that had once trained for war, but now only wanted quiet. As I cut the ribbon, a cheer rose, not loud, not rowdy, but warm. Something settled inside me that day. Not pride, not vindication, just grounding. Afterward, I walked back to my property across gravel, now graded smooth through grass, now green again after months of drought and dirt. The well sat sealed, a monument more than a utility. I stood in front of it for a long while. The sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, painting the plaque in a soft orange glow. I ran my fingers along the words. Let history remind us that not all things are ours to control. It was true. The land had spoken, but I had listened. That's all it ever wanted. I still get letters sometimes. People who saw the story on the news asking for advice on their own HOA battles, or neighbors wanting to understand what aquifer stabilization really means. I respond when I can. Not because I'm an expert, but because I know what it's like to feel alone. To feel small against something that thinks it's bigger than you. But nothing is bigger than truth. Nothing is deeper than roots. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stand still and not move when the ground beneath you trembles. One evening, months after the dust had settled, I sat on my porch as the first rain of the season rolled in. It came slow, tentative, as if the sky wasn't sure it was welcome. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The drops hit the tin roof like fingers tapping gently on an old drum. No flooding, no ruptures, just water returning to the land on its own terms. The earth accepted it. I did too. I'm not here to claim I saved the neighborhood. I didn't. What I did was listen. And when the land asked for help, I said no to the ones who tried to silence it. That's enough. Sometimes justice isn't loud. It's quiet. It's measured. It's the stillness after everything has gone wrong, and something begins to grow again.